I'm really pleased to be able to announce that Cabinet have taken a decision that we will be putting right a decades-long historical injustice. The government will be reimbursing the legal fees that were deducted from the Lake Ellis survivors who went through the first round of reimbursement payments. Subsequent rounds of reimbursement payments had the legal fees paid by the Crown. And many governments over the last 20 or so years have chosen not to put right this wrong, but we are a government that are determined to do right by survivors, and we will be reimbursing those legal fees of the round one claimants. I know how much this means to survivors. I've spoken with a number of them over the last few days to advise them of this decision, and it is an injustice that they've felt for over 20 years and an immense sense of frustration for them over 20 years. And it was really nice to be able to talk to them and tell them about our decision, and it means a huge amount to them. There were multiple governments over the 20 years who chose not to put this right, but we are a government that wants to do right by survivors, and we will put this right.
Of that $2.6 million, some of it's going to go to some admin areas. How much of that money is actually going to go towards the survivors?
Most of it will be going towards survivors. So on average, $28,000 was deducted from their payments over 20 years ago. But the payments will be anywhere between $15,000 and $55,000. But as I say, on average, $28,000.
Will those payments be adjusted for inflation?
We've chosen to take an approach that's consistent with all redress that we pay, which is that we do not adjust for inflation. But as I say, it's a decision that we've taken to put right a historical injustice.
Is that not a further injustice because those that were paid back then, that money is worth significantly more than it is now?
As I say, we've chosen to take a plan that is consistent with all other redress. So we have been paying redress, for example, to Lake Ellis survivors over a 20-year period. That is not inflation adjusted. And so we're just making sure that the decisions we're making are consistent.
Why is it important to you? Is this the end of the line for redress for Lake Ellis, or will there be further to come with the redress scheme for all survivors?
One of the decisions that we're taking at the moment, that we're in the middle of, is around the redress for torture for Lake Ellis. So there will be more to say this year. We've made it a commitment that we will prioritise those torture redress payments this year. So there will be more to say around Lake Ellis.
This legal firm that took $2.6 million, was that simply just because that was the way it worked and then the Crown took it on subsequently, or is this more a case of like corporate greed?
Look, that's a question you might want to put to Mr Cameron. But as I say, there are many governments over many decades who've chosen not to put right this particular wrong, but we have.
Well, yeah, given that the Crown then took on the legal fees for subsequent payments, was that something that was identified back in 2001, as an inequity?
Look, it's been a source of frustration, and the Lake Ellis survivors have said that it has been an inequity for 20 years. Multiple governments chose not to put that right, but we have.
Why not? Why have you sort of gone back to previous governments and asked why they didn't?
I haven't personally gone back to previous Prime Ministers and asked why they didn't put this right, but we're a government that is committed to putting things right for survivors.
It's 15 to 55,000 per person. Is that what it's saying?
The range of legal fees that were deducted go anywhere between 15 and 55, but on average $28,000 was deducted.
Well, how much will actual people get in the end then?
They will be able to go and take their receipt to the Ministry of Health, and we will reimburse them for their full legal fees.
Minister, why is it important to you to use the word justice today?
Look, I think because round two, and since round two, we have always paid legal fees, and for other claimants as well. And so this was a sense of real frustration for those survivors. They've mentioned it to me when I've met with them. They've been to the media. They've mentioned it in the when you do something for one group and not for another, that's an injustice.
But after the legal fees, what do people get in terms of compensation?
Well, all of the, almost all of the Lake Ellis survivors will have received compensation in the past for what they went through at Lake Ellis. We will be now reimbursing them for their legal fees if they've had to pay those. But as I've said, there will be further things to say about redress for torture this year, and we've made it a priority.
Minister, have you had the opportunity to canvass any of the Lake Alice survivors ahead of time about whether they deem this appropriate redress for now?
Look, I've spoken to many Lake Alice survivors, and I've spoken to the ones who were involved in round one claims, who saw this as an injustice, and the ones that I've spoken to they were overwhelmed. You know, a number of them were really emotional on the phone, and they see this as something that has needed to be put right for many years, but finally has been.
So they're across the full detail of today's announcement?
The ones that I've spoke to are, and the Crown Response Unit have been in touch with the other survivors as well, as far as I'm aware.
What is your expectation around, for those now finding out, based on what you've heard already, what their response and reaction is going to be?
Look, I think that their first response was to say nothing. They were actually speechless on the phone, many of them, and then just extraordinarily grateful to this government for putting right that wrong. Lake Alice survivors have been through an extraordinary amount over many, many decades. They have not been treated well by successive governments and by the Crown. And so this really is one of those first times, other than the Prime Minister saying when we tabled the report that we believe you and we hear you, this is probably the first big concrete action we've been able to take.
And what led your reasoning for, or the Crown Response reasoning for putting the Lake Alice group sort of first when it comes to redress steps?
Oh, look, we know that many of the Lake Alice survivors are not in good health. What happened to them many, many years ago, has really impacted on their health and well-being. And that's why we also chose a few weeks ago to make sure that there was that $20,000 payment to those available to those who were nearing the end of their life. And look, many of them are not in a good state of health. And we also know that what happened at Lake Alice was the worst. All survivors that I've spoken to know that, you got sent to Lake Alice. That was the thing that everyone got told wherever you were. If you did something wrong, you would be sent to Lake Alice. That was the worst. And I think most people know that it was important that we had some things to say about Lake Alice and torture first. And also, we will be one of, if not the first country in the world, to redress for torture.
Can you talk us through the next steps ahead of the apology? Will there be anything more for survivors to hear leading up to that date?
The redress payments and the redress services that we need to work through, it's a hugely complex piece of work, hugely complex, and there are many, many decisions that have to go to Cabinet. We have said that we will prioritise this, and we are, and the Prime Minister will have an update on the day.
Do you know how many survivors that didn't receive that full payment have since died and so won't be able to access this?
We don't have exact details of how many of those Lake Alice survivors have passed on. Of course, there will be some, but there are many who are still alive and who have contacted us, who've told their story at the Royal Commission, who have spoken to me, and this will mean a huge amount to them.
And some survivors are quite dismayed that former staff are still working with mental health patients, for example, the person's working with ACC. Do you think that former people who work at Lake Alice should be able to work with these survivors?
Look, that is a matter for either the Public Service Commission, if they're still working in a government department, and potentially a matter for those registration boards as well.
Do you have a guide for how many people might be in that reimbursement group?
There may be around 70. It's hard to know, but we'll get more information, and obviously we'll be able to process those. We will be able to process those very quickly.
Does the family member of someone who's passed away seek reimbursement for those legal fees?
We've chosen, as I say, to keep a consistent response to redress, and so those people who will be able to put forward their claim for those legal fees will need to be alive, yes.
Cabinet decided not to appoint an independent reviewer. Can you talk us through that decision? Why was it important just to get on with this?
Well, because we knew we didn't need to take any extra time or go to any extra cost, because actually we know who these people are. We know that they went through round one, and they know how much they were charged. So it's a relatively simple equation. So we didn't need to overcomplicate things. They'll be able to bring forward their invoice, and it will be paid.
Given you say it's a relatively simple equation, are you surprised that previous governments didn't do this?
Like, as I've said, many governments over the last 20 years have chosen not to make this payment. It's unfortunate, but we are a government that's committed to survivors and doing the right thing, especially by Lake Alice, and that's why I've made this announcement today, and Cabinet agreed to reimburse those legal fees.
When you say that the Prime Minister will have more to say on the day of the apology, do you mean that on that day survivors will see either a clear path forward how redress is going to happen, or
We're still, as I've said earlier, we are still working through hugely complex decisions that all have to go through Cabinet. We're working as fast as we can, and some of those decisions have yet to be made before the announcement. So, as I've said, the Prime Minister will be able to make an update on the day of the apology.
Given that you know who these survivors are, why won't you just proactively reach out to them to make sure that everybody gets their money? And if they have passed on, will that money go to their family?
What we know is that the group who went through round one, we don't have update contact details for all of them. We do for many, and those who we do, we've been trying to contact over the last few days so that they found out before today. And we've also, as I've said earlier, made the decision to keep our consistent treatment of reimbursement and compensation and redress the same and consistent throughout. So those claimants will need to be alive to make their claim.
Is that unfair? Is that unfair? Is that unfair on those claimants and their families?
But it's a consistent decision that we've just chosen to make.
Is it unfair though?
Yeah, it's consistent, and that's the key here, is to be consistent.
is it fair to ask survivors to re-engage with the Ministry of Health when it would have been the Ministry of Health that oversaw psychiatric care?
Well, the Ministry of Health have been making redress payments for the last 20 years. Look, and I acknowledge that it's always a difficult process coming forward and can be re-traumatising, and all of the departments that are now paying redress out know how important it is to make these processes as simple and as stress-free as possible to not re-traumatise people. And we will, when it comes to these payments, make this as quick and easy as possible. All we will require is a copy of the invoice. We know many survivors already have that. There may be a few who don't, who will need to go to Grant Cameron to grab that invoice. Most of them will already have a copy of this. They just need to submit it and it will be paid.
Why did you choose to name the lawyers in this case?
Oh, it's just a fact, and it's a fact on record in the Royal Commission report as well.
Yeah, but are you criticising them? Is that what you're doing by naming them?
Oh, look, not at all. Grant Cameron is the place to go if survivors don't have their invoice on them. Many do, but if some don't, then Grant Cameron will be the place to go to get a copy of that receipt that they can then pass on to us.
So that's why you've named them. You don't think that the law firm did anything, unfair or unjust?
Well,
by
Cameron.
What are your thoughts?
Well, look, we're putting right a historical wrong. Any questions about Mr. Cameron's fees should be put to him,
Who you put him in the
so people know where to go to get their invoice. Yeah. Great. Thank you very much.